Did you know? The Super Nintendo was developed in response to the Sega Genesis growing in market share. Nintendo was satisfied with the sales of NES games and had no immediate plans to develop a new console. Even after the release of Sega's hit Sonic the Hedgehog, Nintendo was unimpressed and convinced their games were better. But as the Genesis grew and developers drifted to Sega, it dawned on Nintendo that their grip on the industry was slipping. The Genesis also had an impact on the Super Nintendo's design. The system was called the Super Famicom in Japan and had a bright, colorful presentation with a multicolored logo and buttons. But the North American branch of Nintendo did not want the system to be perceived as a toy. This is why the Super Nintendo has a more muted color scheme and a dark gray logo. The system was given a curved loading bay to help prevent a common service issue from the previous console generation. Some gamers would place drinks and bowls of cereal on top of the flat NES, leading to spills through the ventilation duct and inevitable damage. This is also why the Super Nintendo's air vent is on the back. During the production of early Super Nintendo units, a mixture of flame-retardant chemicals were added to the plastic formula for safety reasons, but several batches had an improper mixture of the chemicals, leaving some units of the Super Nintendo susceptible to a yellow discoloration over time. Many years later, fans discovered ways to remove the yellow color with a combination of cleaning chemicals. During early stages of development, one of the prototype designs for the North American Super Nintendo featured a crank lever mechanism to load and unload games. Many early prototypes were different in shape and size from the Super Famicom. Nintendo rejected these designs because, in addition to wanting something simple to use, they didn't want to change the internal components between the North American and Japanese versions of the console. In fact, the identical internal hardware means that Super Nintendo systems can play Super Famicom games with only a simple modification. The system's only region locking was the fact that the cartridges were shaped differently for each region. Some early concepts for the Super Famicom included backward compatibility with an additional slot for Famicom games, but this idea was scrapped to save cost. There was even a prototype unit that would connect the Super Famicom and Famicom games. The Super Famicom was designed with the intention of adding expansion units on the bottom, including the ill-fated Nintendo PlayStation and the Japanese-only Satellaview add-on. The Satellaview was a method of digital distribution through satellite, similar in concept to Sega's Mega Modem and the Sega Channel services. The add-on featured exclusive downloadable games like F-Zero 2 and a remake of the first Zelda game with a Link to the Past graphics. It also featured a very early system of downloadable content that was stored on expansion cartridges. In addition to playing games, Satellaview players could listen to real-time radio shows and read digital magazines, all of which were accessed in an Earthbound-like hub world. Nintendo continued to support the Satellaview for 5 years until March 2000. North America had their own network-enabled hardware called the X-Band, which also had a version for the Genesis. It was the world's first console gaming network, and it worked by emulating local multiplayer over a telephone line. The service cost $10 a month plus long-distance fees. The Super Nintendo also had a working prototype for a cartridge that enabled adults to use online banking. It was intended for households that didn't have a personal computer, and the cartridge would have come with a unique keyboard controller. Unlike the NES, the Super Nintendo faced a serious market rival for the duration of its life cycle. Sega came out with aggressive advertisements that were unlike anything Nintendo had dealt with before. Vice President of Design at Nintendo of America stated in an interview for the book The Ultimate History of Video Games, "Sega came out slamming us in their commercials. They were naming us by name, and that was a really big deal. We took it good-natured and competed the best we could." Nintendo also lost favor with some publishing companies because of their strict quality control standards and high licensing fees. Many Japanese publishers that had success on the NES were happy to oblige, and supplied the Super Nintendo with a large library of quality games. But some publishers in North America felt the standards were unfair and that the license fees were too high. This was especially true when compared to the PC games market. For this reason, Electronic Arts had a special partnership with Sega, which gave the Genesis popular sports games. This contributed to the image that the Genesis was a more mature console than the Super Nintendo. One of the biggest blows to the Super Nintendo's reputation came when Mortal Kombat was ported to both the Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The Genesis version included red blood like the arcade version, but Nintendo effectively censored their version by changing the color of the blood and altering some fatalities. The resulting comparison caused an enormous backlash and harmed Nintendo's image with core gamers. This marketing blunder didn't happen without warning. Former Nintendo Executive Vice President Howard Lincoln recalled, "Acclaim kept coming back and saying, 'Look, we're going to make the Sega version, and it's going to be right in line with the coin-op game. Having a toned-down version for Nintendo? Do you guys really want us to do that? Does that really make sense? Nintendo's strict code of standards excluded excessive blood, and they rarely made exceptions, so they forced the change. As a result, the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat outsold Nintendo's censored version 4-1. The results were so painful for the Super Nintendo that some industry members suggested that senatorial hearings in North America about violence in video games was crafted by lobbyists working for Nintendo. One of the unintended consequences of the hearings is that they served as free advertisement for SEGA and bumped up sales for both Mortal Kombat and the Sega CD exclusive Night Trap. When Mortal Kombat 2 was released on the Super Nintendo, Acclaim was allowed to have red blood in the game, and the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat 2 sold better than the Genesis version. After the hearings in North America, Nintendo, Sega, and many other video game companies met and agreed on the industry standard ESRB rating system. After the ESRB was established, Nintendo became much more lenient about the content of their games. Another change to Nintendo after the violence in video games hearings was their marketing. No longer able to claim it was purely a family-friendly system, Nintendo of America tried to outdo Sega at their own game by targeting an older demographic. They even had mild comical gore in a commercial for Super Mario World 2. Many fans believe Nintendo's crass advertising went too far in the case of Earthbound. Instead of staying true to the goofy, lighthearted tone of the series, the marketing department attempted a form of reverse psychology featuring gross-out humor. Some magazine ads claimed, "This game stinks," and included scratch-and-sniff stickers based on foul odors. Earthbound sold very poorly in North America, and the advertisements are often blamed for the poor sales. South Korea got the system shortly after it released in Japan. However, it was named the Super Comboy and was distributed by Hyundai. This was due to laws that aimed to censor any and all Japanese culture in South Korea after World War II. Hyundai also distributed the original Nintendo as the Comboy, the Nintendo 64 as the Comboy 64, and the Game Boy as the Mini Comboy. Speaking of the Game Boy, the Super Nintendo wasn't powerful enough to emulate a Game Boy through software. So in order for the Super Game Boy to play actual Game Boy games, it had all the vital components of a Game Boy inside it. These components process the game, and the Super Nintendo simply displays the image. Did you also know that the GameCube was planned to have motion controls, or that there's several hidden jingles in the GameCube's boot-up sequence? For more Nintendo facts, click the annotation on the screen to watch the Did You Know Gaming video on the Nintendo GameCube. And don't forget to subscribe to Did You Know Gaming for more facts and trivia. And if you like this video, consider giving it a like and a share. And hey, I'm ProJared. When I wasn't playing my Super Nintendo, I was playing Carmen Sandiego. Remember that game? And that show? I did a video on both. You can give that a watch too if you'd like. I'd appreciate it. I love you.